The hiss came before the pain, sharp and merciless. 1 second I was stirring the pot, the steam rising against my face, the smell of garlic and onions filling the air of our Texas kitchen. The next, a searing rush of boiling water struck my back, scorching through my thin shirt, branding my skin with agony I could not name fast enough. My stepfather, Randall Pike, had lifted the pot without warning and poured it over me, as if I were nothing more than the dirty floor beneath his boots. I stumbled forward, my palms slapping against the counter, the sound echoing like gunfire in my ears. The heat spread with cruel precision, crawling across my shoulders and down my spine. My body wanted to scream, but the shock clamped down on my throat. I heard him say it, his voice low, certain full of venom. "That is what happens when you talk back." His words landed like another strike, as punishing as the scalding water. My knees buckled and I collapsed to the tile, the kitchen spinning, the taste of salt and smoke filling my mouth. The room went silent. My mother Susan sat stiff at the table, her hands frozen over her napkin. My brother Ethan looked away as if pretending not to see me could erase the moment. The smell of burned fabric mixed with the Sunday roast still in the oven, a grotesque pairing that made me gag. No one moved. Not a single hand reached out. My stepfather towered above me, his chest rising and falling like a man who had won a battle. And me, Olivia Hayes, 19 years old, lay on the kitchen floor in Fort Worth, Texas, knowing that this was no accident. It was the proof of everything I had feared for years made visible in one brutal instant. From the outside, our house in Fort Worth looked like the picture of Southern respectability. 2 stories of cream brick and navy shutters, a neat lawn edged with trimmed hedges, and a flag that fluttered above the porch every morning without fail. Neighbors often slowed their cars just to glance at it, and if they stopped by for a barbecue or a holiday party, they would leave saying the same thing. The Pikes know how to keep a fine home. They never knew that the shine was only for them. Inside those walls, perfection was demanded and forced, and displayed like a trophy, but it was never felt. Randall, my stepfather, carried himself like a man who still wore the uniform of the National Guard. He had the voice of command, the stiff posture, and the certainty that respect was owed, never earned. When he was in public, he was all charm, tipping his hat to older women at church, swapping jokes with the pastor, helping neighbors move heavy furniture. People trusted him, called him reliable, even honorable. At home, the same habits turned into rules so rigid they felt like chains. Napkins folded exactly into squares, forks placed parallel on the table beds inspected each morning like barracks. Randall treated family dinners like inspections, and every minor slip was recorded in the ledger he seemed to keep in his head. My mother Susan played her role as the gracious Southern woman. She hosted potlucks, joined every committee, and kept her hair styled even when she was only going to the grocery store. People adored her smile, always wide, always ready. What they never saw was how rehearsed it was. She could hold a glass of sweet tea in one hand and press the other against my arm with just enough pressure to signal me to keep quiet. She did not shout, she did not fight, but her silence spoke volumes. Then there was Ethan, my older half-brother. Tall, broad-shouldered, the golden child of our family. He wore his University of Oklahoma football jersey like a crown, and Randall displayed his trophies on the mantel, as though each one belonged to him as well. Ethan was celebrated, cheered the son who could do no wrong. At church, people congratulated my parents for raising such a fine young man, and Randall would beam like the compliments were medals pinned to his chest. Ethan had learned early that his safest choice was loyalty to Randall, even if that loyalty came at my expense. And me, Olivia Hayes, I was the shadow. I set the table, I swept the floor, I kept my head down. My presence was never the center of attention, never praised, only tolerated when useful. I was the one who cleaned the silver before holidays, who scrubbed the kitchen floor on my knees, who picked the dead leaves from the flower beds so the neighbors would see beauty instead of neglect. I knew my place, though no one had ever spoken it aloud. It was written in the way my mother's eyes widened when I laughed too loudly, in the way Randall cleared his throat if I tried to offer an opinion, in the way Ethan never defended me. I remember one Sunday when the pastor at our church in Fort Worth gave a sermon about the strength of family. He said a house built on love could not be shaken, that discipline was the foundation of faith. Afterward, people came up to Randall and Susan, shaking their hands, complimenting them on how respectful and clean-cut their children were. I stood beside Ethan in my pressed dress, smiling for the photographs, while Randall's hand rested heavily on my shoulder. The grip was firm, almost possessive, and in that moment, I understood. To the outside world, we were an example. Inside, we were a performance, and I was cast in the role of the obedient daughter who did not speak. The older I grew, the more I recognized that our house was less of a home and more of a stage. Every detail was arranged for an audience that never saw past the curtains. The living room walls were lined with photographs of Ethan in uniforms on football fields, holding trophies, always smiling. My own pictures were limited to a single shelf in the hallway, tucked between a vase and an old Bible, as though my presence needed to be acknowledged, but not celebrated. If guests asked about me, Susan would say I was shy, that I preferred to stay out of the spotlight. She never admitted that I had been pushed there. Randall's favorite stories came from his years in the Guard. He would talk about cooking for entire units, about how he learned to stretch ingredients, about how men depended on him. Neighbors listened in awe, laughing at his jokes, nodding at his lessons about discipline. He carried those stories into our dinners, reminding us that soldiers followed orders, that respect came from obedience. When he looked at Ethan, he saw a reflection of himself, strong and admired. When he looked at me, his gaze sharpened as if I were a weak link in his chain. Susan's contribution to this facade was subtle but powerful. She ironed napkins, polished silver, arranged flowers, and offered casseroles to grieving families from church. She was the first to bring food when someone fell ill and the last to leave community events. People said she was a saint, always giving, always smiling. I knew better. Behind her closed bedroom door, her silence was the price she paid to maintain her place in Randall's world. She never raised her voice, but she never defended me either. Her loyalty was to the appearance of harmony, not to the truth. Ethan thrived in this environment. He was the son who came home with medals and scholarships, the boy who earned nods of approval. Randall bragged about his speed on the field, his strength in the gym, his chances of playing beyond college. My brother learned quickly that agreeing with Randall kept his life easy. If Randall criticized me, Ethan stayed quiet. If Randall punished me, Ethan looked away. Silence was his currency, and it bought him comfort. Our house itself mirrored Randall's need for order. The grass in the yard was cut twice a week. The porch swing was painted every spring. Inside, shoes were lined against the wall like soldiers in formation, and beds were checked for smooth sheets. I used to run my hands over the blankets at night, smoothing every wrinkle before sleep, terrified that Randall would find one in the morning. There was no room for softness, no space for mistakes. To the neighbors in Fort Worth, we were the model family. They saw the Christmas lights strung neatly across the roof, the pumpkins carved in perfect symmetry on Halloween, the coordinated outfits on Easter Sunday. They never saw the way I flinched when Randall entered the room, or how my mother's smile stiffened when I spoke out of turn. They never heard the silence that followed me through the house like a shadow. Sometimes late at night, I would sit by my bedroom window and listen to the faint sounds of the city beyond our neighborhood. Cars on the distant highway trains passing somewhere toward Dallas, voices carried from yards where other families laughed together. I would imagine myself slipping out the door, walking down the street, and never coming back. But I always stayed. I stayed because appearances mattered more than freedom, because Randall had convinced everyone that control was care, and because Susan feared scandal more than she feared the truth. That was the facade. A family admired from the sidewalk, feared from within. A house polished to perfection, built not on love, but on silence. And me, Olivia Hayes, trapped in the role of the daughter who kept quiet, who learned to exist without being seen. When I think about my childhood, what rises first is not laughter or warmth, but the small humiliations that built themselves into walls around me. They came in moments so sharp that they carved themselves into my memory, moments that told me what my place was long before I was old enough to question it. I was 9 when I spilled a glass of milk across the kitchen counter. The sound of the glass tipping the splash across the floor, the white liquid spreading toward the edge, felt like the end of the world. Randall appeared before I could reach for a towel. His eyes narrowed, his jaw set, and he told me to kneel in the storage room. It was a small, dark space that smelled of dust and gasoline. He told me to stay there for 2 hours without moving. My knees pressed into the concrete until they burned. At first, I tried to count the seconds, but time stretched until it became endless. When I was finally allowed out, my legs trembled so badly I could not stand straight. My mother passed me in the hallway without a word. At 11, I made the mistake of leaving a ring of water on the living room table. Randall called me over, held a glass filled with ice water, and told me to place both hands around it. I held it until my fingers turned red and stiff until the sting made me bite the inside of my cheek to keep from crying. He told me, "Now you understand what carelessness costs." I nodded, though I understood nothing but pain. My mother watched from the sofa, her lips pressed tightly together, and said nothing. At 13, during a Christmas dinner, I interrupted Ethan by accident. Randall ordered me to sit on the floor and finish my plate there. Guests laughed awkwardly, thinking it was a joke, but no one stopped it. I sat cross-legged on the tile, my fork clinking against the plate as conversation continued above me. That night, I learned that even joy could be turned into punishment. By 15, I had discovered cooking as a small escape. I applied for a summer program in Dallas, a scholarship that would have cost my family nothing. When the acceptance letter arrived, I hid it under my mattress for 3 days, savoring the thought of leaving even for a few weeks. Randall found it anyway. He held it in his hands, read it slowly, then walked to the kitchen sink. He struck a match, lit the edge, and dropped it into the basin. I watched the flames consume the paper until only ash remained. He told me no daughter of his would waste time flipping burgers when there was a house to maintain. I felt something inside me crumble as I stood there. Through all of it, Susan kept up her role as the gracious wife. Sometimes she would push a sandwich across the counter after Randall had finished with me, as though food could erase silence. She never touched the wounds that showed, never spoke of the punishments, never challenged him. Her kindness came in whispers and gestures so small they almost vanished, but they were never enough to shield me. Each of these moments stacked on top of each other, one humiliation balanced over the next until they formed the architecture of my childhood. They were not random. They were deliberate, consistent, and wrapped in the language of discipline. By the time I reached 16, I had learned to move through the house like a shadow. I knew which floorboards creaked, which cabinet doors slammed too loudly, which chores had to be done before Randall came home. I studied the rules as if they were scripture, because breaking them meant punishment, and punishment meant silence that lasted longer than the pain. One night, I was watching a cooking show on the old television in the kitchen. The host was making croissants, folding the dough with such care that I leaned forward, trying to memorize every movement. Randall walked in, saw the screen, and pulled the plug from the wall. The sudden blackness felt like a blow. He told me to stop dreaming that a house like ours did not need fantasy. I sat there staring at the blank screen, wishing I could crawl inside it and disappear. There were moments when I tried to push back, though, always in secret. I would burn toast on purpose, hoping Randall would ban me from cooking, but instead, he said, burned food built patience. I would write down recipes in a notebook hidden beneath my mattress, knowing that discovery could mean punishment. That notebook became my diary, my one act of rebellion. Every page carried not only ingredients, but the memory of what had happened that day. It was my proof that I was still here, still trying, still myself beneath the silence. Even the holidays carried their own lessons. At Thanksgiving one year, Randall carved the turkey with the same precision he used to inspect our rooms. When I reached for the salt without asking, he slapped my hand against the table. The sound cracked through the dining room. No one said anything. Ethan kept eating my mother-refilled glasses, and the conversation carried on as though nothing had happened. The sting faded, but the humiliation clung to me for weeks. At 17, I entered a school baking competition. I worked for days practicing late into the night with ingredients I bought using coins saved from babysitting. When I placed second, the certificate felt like a medal of freedom. I brought it home smiling, hoping maybe for once Randall would look at me with pride. He did not even lift his eyes from the newspaper. He asked what a piece of paper like that would ever buy me, then told me to stop wasting time. I pinned the certificate to the fridge anyway, clinging to that small victory. A week later, it vanished. No one admitted to taking it. Through all those years, Susan continued her quiet, rehearsed performance. She kept our home spotless, our clothes pressed, our church attendance perfect. To anyone outside, she was proof of Randall's success, the polished jewel of his authority. To me, she was the confirmation that silence was survival. She never shouted, never scolded, but she never defended me either. Her loyalty was to peace at any cost, even if it meant my suffering. Looking back, those flashbacks blur together into a pattern I could not yet name. Each act of control seemed small on its own, but together they built a cage. A child who kneels in a storage room learns obedience. A teenager whose dreams are burned in the sink learns resignation. By the time I turned 18, I no longer believed escape was possible. I thought my life would always be bound by Randall's rules and Susan's silence. What I did not know was that it would all collapse in a single night with the rush of boiling water and the shattering of every mask they had worked so hard to keep in place. The night it finally happened was meant to be a celebration. Randall and Susan had invited a handful of church members to our house people who admired the way Susan hosted with style, and Randall commanded a room with his booming laugh. Ethan had driven down from Oklahoma for the weekend, bringing with him the glow of another win on the football field. Everyone was ready to toast his success. I was ready too, but for something else entirely. I wanted to prove that I could prepare a meal that would impress them all, a meal no one could ignore. I had spent the afternoon in the kitchen chopping, stirring, basting, moving as quickly as my hands allowed. The roast was golden brown, the potatoes crisp, the salad fresh with herbs I had clipped from the small patch of garden behind the house. The smell of rosemary and garlic filled the air. I felt proud, though I tried to keep that pride quiet, knowing how easily it could be crushed. Randall hovered near me for most of the preparation. He stood with his arms folded, issuing commands in that clipped voice of his. Lower the heat. Stir faster. Add more salt. Each word chipped at me, but I kept moving. Obedience was the safest path. Susan floated in and out, adjusting candles and arranging the crystal glasses as though she were preparing for royalty. Ethan laughed with one of the guests in the living room, his voice carrying down the hall like music from another world. The one thing that went wrong was the sauce. It was a simple reduction, something I had practiced, but Randall's constant interruptions pulled my attention from the stove. By the time I turned back, the heat was too high. The sauce had curdled, separating into a grainy mess. I tried to save it, whisking furiously, adding butter, straining it twice, but the smooth texture never returned. My hands shook as I poured it into the serving dish. I thought about throwing it out, lying, saying I had planned to serve without sauce, but fear pushed me to carry it to the table anyway. Dinner began with forced laughter and clinking glasses. Randall sat at the head, his presence filling the room. Susan glowed with practiced charm, offering seconds complimenting guests. Ethan told stories about college games, his arm slung casually over the chair, his girlfriend smiling beside him. For a brief moment, I almost believed I could blend into this picture. Then Randall lifted his fork and tasted the sauce. He chewed slowly, placed the fork back down, and dabbed his mouth with a napkin as if preparing to give a sermon. His eyes found mine across the table, hard and unyielding. "What is this, Olivia?" he asked. My voice came out small, the words barely leaving my throat. The sauce did not set right. I tried to fix it. He repeated my words, his voice rising. "You tried to fix it. This is how you thank us. You ruin his dinner. You ruin everything." His hand slammed against the table. Conversation stopped. Susan murmured his name, trying to steady him, but her voice was too soft to matter. I felt the air shift, the silence heavy and waiting. Randall's chair screeched against the floor as he stood. My body tensed before I even turned toward the kitchen. I heard the scrape of metal against the stove, the sudden lift of weight. The pot was still half full of boiling water. The steam rose in a furious cloud as Randall gripped the pot. I barely had time to turn before he swung it forward and the boiling water spilled across my back. The pain was instant, white, hot, tearing through my skin like fire. My scream caught in my throat, and all that came out was a strangled gasp as my knees gave way. I hit the tile floor hard, my palms scraping against the rough surface, the smell of scorched fabric and burned skin filling the air. For a moment, the room was silent, as though every sound had been swallowed. Then came his voice, heavy and cold, echoing above me. That is what happens when you talk back. His words were final, not a warning, not an outburst, but a sentence delivered. My vision blurred the edges of the room, spinning. I tried to push myself up, but my arms trembled under the weight of shock. I looked toward the table. Susan held a napkin over her mouth, her eyes fixed on the plate in front of her. Ethan's gaze flickered toward me, then away, as if he had trained himself not to see. The guests shifted in their chairs, uncomfortable, but no one stood. Forks rested on plates, glasses half raised, the performance of normalcy waiting to resume. The water clung to my skin, soaking through my shirt, the heat relentless. My breath came in shallow bursts, each one sharp with pain. I crawled toward the edge of the counter, pulling myself up with shaking hands, my fingers slipping against the slick tile. My reflection in the oven door was pale, wide-eyed, unrecognizable. Randall set the pot back onto the stove with deliberate calm, as though the act had been nothing more than a correction. He returned to his chair, adjusted his napkin, and lifted his glass. His voice was steady as he told the others to eat, that there was no reason to let the food grow cold. The scrape of cutlery began again, soft at first, then louder until it drowned out my shallow breaths. Susan rose from her chair only long enough to turn off the burner, then sat back down. Her eyes never met mine. Ethan whispered something to his girlfriend, who nodded quickly, her face pale. One of the guests coughed, another reached for the bread, and conversation slowly returned, fragmented at first, then steady as though nothing had happened. I stumbled toward the bathroom, each step sending a new wave of agony across my back. The mirror showed angry red blotches spreading across my shoulders, the skin raw and blistering. I gripped the sink with both hands, fighting the urge to collapse. I wanted to cry, to scream, to tear the walls down with my voice, but I knew what that would bring. Instead, I pulled my phone from my pocket and raised it with shaking fingers. The click of the camera was quiet, but it felt like thunder. Proof. I slipped into a hoodie, the fabric rough against my burns, and returned to the table. My seat was still waiting untouched, as though my absence had been nothing more than a pause in the evening. Susan leaned close as I sat down, her voice barely audible. Sit. Eat. Do not make a scene. I obeyed, each bite a test of endurance, each swallow a reminder that silence was the rule. As glasses clinked and laughter returned, I sat in that hoodie, my body screaming, my heart pounding, and one thought repeating louder than all the rest. This time I will not forget. This time I will not let it disappear. I waited until the guests had gone, until the last dish had been scrubbed and the kitchen shone as though nothing had happened. My back burned with every movement, the hoodie sticking to my skin, but I kept my face blank. Randall sat in the living room with the television on. Susan folded napkins at the table. Ethan scrolled through his phone. The world inside that house had already moved forward, but I could not. At midnight, when the house finally fell silent, I slipped into my shoes and eased the door open. The night air in Fort Worth was thick with summer heat, heavy enough to cling to my lungs, but it felt like freedom compared to the suffocating quiet behind me. I walked quickly, pulling the hoodie tighter every step, sending sharp pain through my back. I flagged down a rideshare near the corner. The driver glanced at me in the mirror once, then looked away. I was grateful for his silence. John Peter Smith Hospital was bright against the dark sky, its fluorescent lights buzzing as I stepped into the emergency entrance. The antiseptic smell hit me first, sharp and sterile, almost enough to cover the scent of scorched fabric that still clung to me. I gave my name at the desk and muttered something about spilling hot water. The woman behind the counter looked at me for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, but she handed me a clipboard without comment. My hands shook as I filled in the lines, the pen slipping on the paper. A nurse called me in after 20 minutes that felt like an eternity. She guided me to a curtained bed, asked me to remove the hoodie. My breath caught as the fabric peeled away, pulling at the raw skin beneath. The nurse froze, her eyes widening before she masked it with practiced calm. She applied a cool compress and told me the doctor would be in shortly. Dr. David Miller entered with a tired face and gentle hands. He asked what happened, and I repeated the lie. I slipped, carrying hot water. His eyes lingered on mine for a moment, as though he had heard the same words many times before. He examined my back with care, then asked softly, "Do you have any other injuries?" My throat tightened. I said no, but he asked again, and this time he touched along my spine. When his fingers pressed against a spot low on my back, I flinched. He nodded slowly. "I want to run some scans," he said, "just to be sure." His tone left no room for refusal. The MRI machine hummed around me, its sound like a distant drumbeat, steady and inescapable. I lay perfectly still, staring at the inside of the dome, trying not to think, trying not to remember. When it was over, I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the thin gown around me, my skin still burning, my heart racing. Dr. Miller returned with a folder in his hands. His expression had changed heavier now, more certain. He placed the scans on the counter and pointed to the images. Compressed vertebrae here, healed fractures along the rib cage, minor scarring in the soft tissue. "These are not from last night, Olivia. These are older." His voice was quiet but firm. "This is not a single accident. This is repeated trauma." The words landed harder than the boiling water had. For the first time, someone named it. For the first time, I was not imagining it. My breath shook as I nodded. He did not push me to explain. He simply said, "I am required to file a report. You do not have to talk about it now, but know this. What happened to you is not normal, and it is not your fault." I asked Dr. Miller for copies of the scans. My voice shook, but I held his gaze as I spoke. He nodded and printed them, sliding the images into a large envelope. He handed it to me as though it were both fragile and powerful, and in that moment it felt like both. Proof. Not bruises that would fade, not burns that could be covered, but evidence stamped in black and white, undeniable. He gave me ointment for the burns bandages, a referral to a physical therapist, and the number of a counselor. He told me the hospital would follow up, that someone from the county might call. I listened, but my mind clung only to the envelope in my lap. My fingers pressed against the cardboard as if afraid it might vanish. When I stepped out into the parking lot, the night air hit me hard. I stood there for a moment, staring at the streetlights, feeling as though the ground beneath me had shifted. I slid into the back seat of another rideshare, the envelope clutched tight against my chest. The driver did not speak, and I was grateful again for silence. The city lights blurred past, and for the first time, I wondered what it would feel like to be believed. Back in my room, I placed the envelope on the table and stared at it. My back throbbed, the skin raw and burning, but the fire in my chest felt stronger. I paced the floor, unable to sit still. The house around me was quiet. Randall's snores drifting down the hall. Susan's footsteps fading after a midnight trip to the kitchen. They had no idea. For the first time, the power they carried over me felt less certain. I opened the envelope again, spread the scans across my desk, and traced the outlines with trembling fingers. Each line, each shadow, each mark was a story I had never told. Here was the proof of the nights spent on concrete floors, the silent punishments, the moments I had convinced myself were survivable. My suffering had been etched into bone and tissue, captured by a machine that could not lie. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the group chat where Susan had once written that I ruined important nights, where Ethan had dismissed me as dramatic. I screenshotted each message, saving them into a folder I named Truth. Then I took photos of the burns on my back, twisting in the mirror, capturing the raw red skin. I added those to the folder too. For the first time I saw my pain not as weakness, but as evidence. Each scar was a witness, each mark a testimony. I sat there until dawn, the scans spread before me, the folder open on my screen, my body aching but my mind alive. I realized that silence had protected them, not me. And now I had the means to break it. When the first light crept through the blinds, I pressed the envelope flat against the desk and whispered to myself, "This time will be different. This time I will not disappear." The scans stayed on my desk like silent companions daring me to act. Every time I glanced at them, I felt the weight of years pressing down and the possibility of release rising up. For days, I carried the envelope everywhere, tucked into my backpack like a shield. I knew Randall would explode if he discovered it, but that fear no longer outweighed the need for truth. The first thing I did was organize. I created a folder on my laptop titled Truth. Into it, I dropped the photos of my burns raw and angry across my back, taken in the bathroom mirror. I added the screenshots from the family group chat where my mother's words cut sharper than any belt, and Ethan's dismissal stung deeper than bruises. I uploaded the hospital scans labeling each file with the date and time. When I finished, the folder glowed on the screen like a small fortress. My evidence was no longer just memories, no longer whispers I doubted myself for. It was real, documented, undeniable. But evidence alone would not be enough. I needed someone who could help me turn it into a story that others would see, someone who would believe me without hesitation. My mind returned to a name I had not spoken in years: Hannah Lopez. We had been close in middle school, sharing secrets in the library, laughing about nothing until my father's rules tightened around me and Randall's watchful eye cut every tie. I had lost touch when sleepovers and extracurriculars were banned, but I knew from social media that Hannah was now a journalism student at the University of North Texas. For 3 days, I debated calling her. I drafted and deleted the message a dozen times. What if she laughed? What if she thought I was dramatic, just like Ethan had said? Finally, one night, my hands trembling, I pressed call. She answered on the third ring. Her voice was warm, surprised, like a doorway opening. Olivia, she said, it's been forever. I swallowed hard. I have something I need to tell you, something I can prove. Her tone shifted instantly, serious, steady. Where are you? She asked. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop in Denton, far enough from Fort Worth that I felt a little safer. The next afternoon, I sat across from her at a small table, the envelope of scans in my lap. Hannah studied me with eyes that had not changed since middle school, eyes that still carried kindness and curiosity. I began slowly, my voice shaking, as I told her about Randall, about the punishments, about the boiling water that had finally pushed me to the hospital. I showed her the photos, the screenshots, the scans. She did not interrupt. She just listened, her pen poised but unused, as if she knew silence was what I needed most. When I finished, I expected disbelief, maybe pity. Instead, Hannah leaned back and said quietly, "This is big. Are you ready for what it means?" I nodded. "I am not doing this for attention," I said. "I am doing this so it does not happen again. Not to me, not to anyone else." Her smile was small, but her eyes were steel. "Good," she said. "Then we will do it right." We spent hours in that Denton cafe, the noise of espresso machines and clinking cups surrounding us like a protective shell. Hannah flipped through the folder on my laptop, pausing on each image, each scan, each screenshot. She asked careful questions: dates, times, who was present, what was said. I answered slowly, sometimes stopping when memories pressed too hard against my chest. She never rushed me. She just nodded, jotting notes in the margins of her notebook. Her plan was methodical. First, she wanted to write a feature for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, where she freelanced. The focus, she explained, would not be just my story, but the larger issue of hidden abuse revealed through medical evidence. She said if we lead with the scans, the facts are undeniable. Your name can be changed for the article, but the images will speak louder than anything. I felt both exposed and protected by her words. We set up a timeline together. I scrolled through old messages and dug up emails from school, even old attendance reports that showed unexplained absences. Each piece felt like another brick in a wall I was finally building for myself, not against me. Hannah suggested we corroborate my memories with professionals. She asked if I would let her contact Dr. Miller. I hesitated, then agreed. If he had already seen the truth in my body, maybe he would be willing to speak to it publicly. The following week, we met again, this time in the library at her campus. Hannah had already drafted an outline. She wanted to open with the MRI images side by side, one showing compressed vertebrae, the other, the fresh burns. Then she would weave in my words, my diary entries from the notebook I had hidden for years, my screenshots. She asked me to write a personal essay to accompany the piece, something raw but steady. I spent 2 nights hunched over my desk, the glow of the screen casting long shadows, pouring every memory into sentences that hurt to write. When I handed it to her, she read it in silence, then looked up with tears in her eyes. "Olivia, this is powerful," she whispered. Even as hope stirred, fear clung to me. Every vibration of my phone made me jump. Every sound of Randall's footsteps in the hall sent chills through me. I kept the folder hidden behind layers of passwords, backing it up on a drive I tucked into the lining of my bag. I knew that if Randall or Susan found out before we were ready, the consequences could be brutal. Still, Hannah's presence gave me a kind of strength I had never known. She believed me without question. She reminded me that silence was what had kept me caged, and that truth, no matter how painful, was a key. One night, sitting in her dorm room surrounded by stacks of newspapers and textbooks, she looked at me and said, "You are not just surviving anymore, Olivia. You are fighting back." The words stayed with me. For the first time, the idea of fighting back did not feel like a fantasy. It felt possible. The article went live on a Wednesday afternoon. Hannah had worked tirelessly fact-checking, revising, weaving my essay into her feature until it felt both personal and universal. The headline hit me like a punch, hidden scars, when ER scans tell the truth. Beneath it, two images sat side by side. On the left, the MRI of my spine with evidence of old injuries. On the right, the photograph of the burns across my shoulders, raw and undeniable. My name had been changed, but the truth was clear. At first, I thought no one would notice. I refreshed the page every few minutes, my heart racing, expecting silence. But by the end of the day, the shares had climbed into the thousands. By midnight, the article had 20,000 hits, the comment section flooding with voices. Survivors recognized their own experiences in my words. Strangers wrote messages of anger, sympathy, solidarity. A hashtag began to trend on Twitter, #BoilingPointSurvivor. I sat in my room phone, buzzing nonstop, my chest tight with a mixture of fear and relief. For years, I had been invisible, my pain dismissed as exaggeration, my voice silenced. Now suddenly, the world was listening. The backlash at home came swiftly. Susan was the first to call. She left a voice message, her words shaking with fury. "How dare you expose us like this? Do you have any idea what this will do to your stepfather's reputation? What will the neighbors think?" She never mentioned the burns. She never asked if I was alive. Her only concern was the image of the family she had worked so hard to present. Randall's reaction came later that night. He stormed into my room, red-faced phone in his hand. His voice was low, dangerous. "You think you can ruin me with lies?" He hissed the word. Lies, as if repeating it would make the truth disappear. I clutched my laptop tight, my finger pressing record on my phone, hidden beneath the pillow. His threats spilled out, each one heavier than the last. I saved every second. Ethan's response came through text, short, bitter, cold. "You went too far. Whatever happened, you didn't have to make it public. Mom won't stop crying. You always were dramatic." I read it twice, the word dramatic flashing like a neon sign, the same label he had given me since childhood. This time, instead of shrinking, I screenshotted it and dragged it into the truth folder. Another brick for the wall. The noise online only grew. Local stations picked up the piece. Advocacy groups reposted it. Hannah texted me in awe, saying she had never seen an article gain traction so quickly. At first, I wanted to hide. Every vibration of my phone made me flinch, but then I read the messages from women in neighboring towns, from men who admitted they too had grown up in homes where silence was law. One wrote, "Your story gave me the courage to finally tell my wife what happened to me as a kid." Another said, "I thought I was alone until I saw those scans." Their words stitched something inside me that had been frayed for years. My fear did not vanish, but it shifted. It was no longer the fear of being invisible. It was the fear of what might come next, of the storm Randall and Susan would unleash. But this time, I was not alone. The world was watching. The next 48 hours were a blur of chaos. The article spread beyond Fort Worth, picked up by Dallas news outlets, then shared nationally through survivor networks. By Friday morning, my phone was flooded with requests for interviews. A podcast wanted me to tell my story. A nonprofit asked if I would join a panel about hidden abuse. Hannah forwarded me emails from editors in New York asking if she had access to more records. I had never felt so exposed and yet never so validated. Randall's rage grew with each new headline. He left me voicemails thick with threats, swearing he would drag me into court for defamation. His voice cracked when he said I had betrayed him. The irony almost made me laugh. For years he had demanded silence in the name of loyalty, and now he dared to call me a traitor for breaking it. Each voicemail went straight into my truth folder. I played them back only once, just long enough to save them, then I muted his number. Susan tried a different approach. She knocked on my bedroom door late at night, her face pale, her hands twisting a dish towel. "If you pull this back now," she whispered, "maybe we can fix it as a family." Her eyes were desperate not with love, but with fear of scandal. I looked at her for a long moment, then closed the door without answering. That silence was my answer. Ethan refused to speak to me directly, but I saw the fallout in real time. His football scholarship was suspended pending investigation after the story connected him to the family environment. His name trended online alongside mine, though his messages calling me dramatic were the only words people quoted. For once, the golden child's shine was tarnished. Online, the response was overwhelming. The hashtag boiling point survivor was joined by another hashtag louder than silence. Survivors from across the country began posting their own scans, their own stories of injuries explained away as accidents. A movement was building, and somehow my story had become its spark. Still, the weight of it pressed heavy on me. I stayed awake at night scrolling through messages, some kind, some cruel. For every voice of support, there were whispers calling me attention, seeking, ungrateful, vindictive. I saved those too, not because they hurt less, but because they revealed how deeply silence was still ingrained in people's minds. One evening, Hannah called me, her voice steady. "You need to be ready for what's next," she said. "Randall will not let this go quietly," but she reminded me of something else too. "You are not alone anymore. The truth is louder than any threat." Her words settled into me like an anchor steadying me against the storm. For the first time in years, I felt the balance shifting. Randall's power was no longer absolute. Susan's silence no longer controlled me. Ethan's judgment no longer defined me. The world outside our home had finally seen what lay beneath the polished surface, and they could not unsee it. As I closed my laptop that night, the truth folder secure and growing, I whispered to myself the promise I had carried since the boiling water touched my skin. This time, I will not disappear. The knock came early on a Monday morning. I watched through the blinds as two Fort Worth police officers stood on the porch, their uniforms crisp in the rising sun. Behind them, a neighbor's curtain twitched. When Susan opened the door, the officers stepped forward. Randall's booming voice filled the air almost immediately, demanding explanations, barking orders, as though his tone could override their authority. But this time his voice carried no weight. The body cameras captured every word as they led him down the steps in handcuffs. The neighbors gathered on their lawns, phones raised recording what I had waited years to see. By the time we reached the Tarrant County Courthouse, the story had grown beyond our control. News vans lined the street, reporters shouting questions as I walked in with my lawyer, Dana Mitchell. She was calm, precise, her hand on my shoulder, steadying me as the cameras flashed. For the first time, I wanted the world to see me. Not the invisible girl, not the shadow child, but the witness who had survived. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with anticipation. Randall sat at the defense table, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting toward me with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Susan was 2 rows behind him, arms crossed her face, pale lips pressed tight. Ethan had chosen not to attend. I sat on the opposite side, clutching my folder of evidence, the envelope of scans resting on top like a silent promise. The prosecution began with the evidence Dr. Miller had provided. He took the stand, his voice clear and steady. He described the burns on my back, the pattern of injuries across my body, the healed fractures and scarring. "These are not new injuries," he told the jury. "This is a consistent pattern indicative of repeated trauma over a period of years." His words were simple, clinical, undeniable. Then came the nurse who recalled my first visit to the ER, the way I had winced when she touched my spine, the way my story had faltered. She told the jury that in her experience, my injuries were not consistent with a simple kitchen accident. Each testimony layered the truth until it felt unshakable. The defense tried to counter, painting me as unstable as a young woman seeking attention. They hinted that I had exaggerated for sympathy, that my friendship with Hannah had turned into opportunism. But every time they tried to twist my story, Dana calmly pointed back to the scans, the photos, the saved messages. Lies can be crafted, but bones do not lie. When Hannah took the stand, she described the process of fact-checking, of verifying the scans and images, of consulting legal experts before publishing. Her voice was steady, her conviction firm. The jury leaned forward as she explained how the story had reached thousands, how it had resonated because it carried proof, not just words. I sat there listening, my heart pounding. Every word spoken was both a wound reopening and a scar being validated. For years, I had been told to keep my head down, to stay quiet. Now my truth was amplified in a room filled with strangers who would decide my stepfather's fate. When it was finally my turn to take the stand, I stood slowly, my knees trembling. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat facing the jury. I looked into their eyes and spoke the words I had rehearsed 100 times in the dark. The pain was not the worst part, I said. The silence was. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear my own breath echoing back at me. Every eye was fixed on me as I began to speak. I told them about the night of the boiling water, how the pain seared through my back, how the room fell silent except for Randall's voice. I told them about the years before, that kneeling on cold floors holding ice until my hands blistered being forced to eat on the ground while others laughed at the table. I described the silence that always followed the way Susan's eyes would pass over me as though I were furniture, the way Ethan smirked when I cried. I held nothing back. My voice cracked, but I did not stop. I wanted the jury to feel the weight of every bruise, every insult, every moment I had been erased. And then I held up the scans, the photos, the screenshots. "These are my scars," I said. "This is my truth." Randall's lawyer tried to break me during cross-examination. He asked if I had exaggerated. He suggested that my friendship with Hannah gave me motive to fabricate a story for attention. He waved at the trending hashtags, implying I enjoyed the spotlight. But I did not waver. I looked him in the eye and said, "Bones do not lie. Burns do not lie. And silence never protects the victim, it only protects the abuser." The jury shifted in their seats. I could see some nodding slightly, their expressions hardening. When the defense called Randall to testify, he tried to sound calm, even reasonable. He told stories about discipline, about respect, about how young people today lacked both. He painted himself as a father figure, misunderstood by a resentful stepdaughter. But when the prosecution played the recording, I had saved the voice note where he threatened me, the hiss of betrayal in his words, the mask cracked. His face reddened, his jaw clenched, and for the first time, the jury saw what I had always seen. The trial lasted 3 days. Witness after witness confirmed what I had carried alone for years. By the final morning, the air was thick with anticipation. I sat with Dana, my hands folded tightly as the jury filed back into the room. Their deliberation had taken 5 hours, but to me, it felt like a lifetime. The foreman cleared his throat and spoke the word I had dreamed of hearing but never thought possible. "Guilty. On all counts." The judge's voice followed steady and final. 15 years without parole." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Susan covered her mouth, but I saw no tears. Randall's shoulders slumped for the first time, the weight of authority gone. He refused to look at me as the bailiff stepped forward, hand on his arm, leading him away. I sat still, my body trembling, my chest tight, until I realized I was breathing freely for the first time in years. It was not joy, not triumph, but release. A long-held breath finally exhaled. The chains of silence had snapped, and the world had heard the truth. When I stepped outside, cameras flashed, reporters shouted my name. I raised my head steadier now and gave them one sentence before walking past the microphones. "Truth is louder than shame." The verdict spread through Fort Worth like wildfire. By the next morning, Randall's mugshot appeared on every local broadcast, the same face that had once been celebrated at church picnics and neighborhood cookouts, now branded with criminal shame. The diner where he had once bragged about feeding battalions quietly scrubbed his name from the website. Regulars whispered over their biscuits and coffee, shaking their heads, some in disbelief, others muttering that they had always suspected something was off. Susan became a ghost of herself almost overnight. At church the following Sunday, the same women who once praised her gracious hospitality avoided her pew. Invitations disappeared. The polite smiles turned brittle. In a community where image was currency, hers had collapsed in full view. She moved through the grocery store with her head bowed, her cart half empty, the weight of whispers trailing her like shadows. Ethan's fall was swift and brutal. His football scholarship at the University of Oklahoma was suspended pending investigation. Headlines paired his name with mine, his dismissive text displayed alongside the scans of my injuries. The university released a statement about character and conduct, and though Ethan insisted he had done nothing, the damage was already done. His dream of the NFL dimmed in a matter of weeks. For once, the golden child's shine did not blind the world. At home, the silence was thicker than ever. Susan retreated to her room, the television on at all hours, the volume low but constant. Ethan stopped visiting entirely, citing embarrassment and the need to focus on his classes. The house that had once pulsed with Randall's booming commands now felt hollow, a shell stripped of its power. I moved my things into a small apartment in Austin with the help of a friend from school. The boxes light because I had never owned much. As I locked the door behind me, I felt a quiet victory pulse in my chest. But outside, the noise grew louder. Reporters continued to call, advocacy groups reached out, neighbors left notes on my car. Some offered words of encouragement, others apologies for not speaking sooner. A woman I barely knew from church stopped me in the parking lot of a grocery store and whispered, "I am sorry. I should have asked questions. I should have helped." Her eyes filled with tears, and though I did not hug her, I nodded. It was not forgiveness, but it was something. The internet had its own storm. Hashtags # boiling point, survivor, and # louder than silence merged into a wave of survivor stories across the country. People posted photos of their own hidden scars, their own hospital records, their own truths long buried. Each post carried a piece of the weight I had carried alone, spreading it across thousands of shoulders. For the first time, I understood what it meant to be part of something bigger than my own survival. Yet in the quiet of my new apartment, I still felt the ache. Healing was not instant, and freedom did not erase the years behind me. At night, I heard echoes, the slam of Randall's chair, the scrape of forks after the boiling water spilled. I would wake in a sweat chest tight before realizing I was alone and safe. The pain was not gone, but it was no longer secret. The weeks that followed the trial felt like walking through a landscape that had been both scorched and cleared. Everywhere I turned, the consequences of truth were visible. Randall sat in a cell stripped of his authority, his voice no longer booming but muffled behind concrete walls. Susan filed for a quiet separation, not from him, but from the community that had once upheld her image. She stopped attending church entirely, stopped hosting dinners, stopped pretending. The woman who had polished silver until it gleamed now let dust gather as if polishing it no longer mattered. Neighbors who once waved politely now crossed the street when they saw her. Some whispered apologies to me, but most simply looked away. The mask of the perfect family had shattered, and no one wanted to be caught holding a piece of the glass. Ethan's fall continued. Without his scholarship, he tried to keep playing, but every interview circled back to the same question. "Did you know?" His denial sounded hollow against the weight of his own words, the text messages he had sent me. Eventually, the university announced he would not return for the next season. His girlfriend left him. His once bright future dimmed until it was little more than smoke. For me, the fallout carried both freedom and weight. I walked into grocery stores without flinching at the sight of boiling pots in the aisle displays. I poured coffee in the morning without bracing for a voice to bark behind me. Yet the scars on my back itched as they healed, constant reminders that the past was etched into me, not just memory, but flesh. Media attention continued. A Dallas news station aired a segment about the trial ending with my words on the courthouse steps, "Truth is louder than shame." That clip spread faster than I expected. Strangers began stopping me in parking lots and coffee shops, sometimes just to nod, sometimes to whisper, "Thank you." A retired teacher pressed my hand in the pharmacy aisle and said, "I wish I had spoken up when I suspected." A young mother at the bus stop told me she had finally left her own abusive partner after reading my story. But not all attention was kind. Hate messages slipped into my inbox, some from anonymous accounts, others from people connected to Randall's old life. They called me a liar, a betrayer, a girl who exaggerated. I saved every single one just as I had with his threats dragging them into the truth folder. They became proof of how deep silence ran, how desperate some were to preserve it. Through it all, Hannah stood by me. We met weekly sometimes to plan, sometimes just to breathe. She reminded me that exposure was not the end but the beginning. Every headline, every hashtag, every whispered thank you was a step towards something larger. Her words steadied me when doubt crept in. The fallout was messy, painful, public, but in that mess there was clarity. The world had seen the truth. Randall could no longer twist it. Susan could no longer polish it away. Ethan could no longer dismiss it with a single word. The silence had been broken, and though the pieces cut, they also reflected light. For the first time, I was not living in the shadow of their image. I was standing in my own. After the trial, my days began to stretch into something I barely recognized: quiet. No slammed doors, no shouted orders, no footsteps that made me brace for impact. At first, the silence felt alien, almost menacing, as though Randall might appear again at any moment. But slowly, that silence softened, becoming space I could fill with my own choices. I moved fully into my apartment in Austin, a modest 2-bedroom I shared with a friend from school. The walls were plain, the furniture mismatched, but the freedom was intoxicating. I painted one wall a pale green, the first color I had ever chosen for myself. I pinned photographs above my desk, images of Hannah, of the scans that had saved me, of sunsets I snapped during long evening walks. Each picture felt like proof that I was building a life outside the shadow of that Fort Worth house. Healing did not come in one wave. It came in fragments, small moments stitched together. The first time I boiled water for pasta and did not flinch. The first time I laughed without glancing around to see if it was too loud. The first time I slept through the night without dreaming of steam and fire. These victories were small, but they were mine. Hannah encouraged me to attend a support group run by Texas Voices Against Violence, a nonprofit in Dallas. I resisted at first, convinced that my story had already been told too publicly. But one evening, I sat in a circle of folding chairs surrounded by strangers whose eyes carried the same weight I had carried, and I listened. Women and men spoke of nights filled with fear of scars hidden and scars visible. Each story mirrored mine in some way, though no two were the same. For the first time, I did not feel like a lone voice crying in the dark. When it was my turn to speak, my throat tightened. I expected silence, maybe judgment. Instead, I saw nods, quiet tears, hands reaching across the circle. I spoke of the boiling water, of the ER scans, of the silence that had once felt louder than screams. And when I finished, someone whispered, "Thank you for saying it first." That night changed something in me. I realized that telling my story was not about reliving the pain, it was about freeing myself from it and offering others a path toward their own freedom. Slowly, I began volunteering with the nonprofit, helping to organize fundraisers, speaking at small events, listening to survivors who were just beginning to find their voices. Each conversation stitched another piece of strength into me. I began to see my scars differently. They were no longer just marks of suffering. They were testimony, physical proof that I had endured, that I had fought back, that I had survived. And survival, I learned, was not betrayal. Silence was not loyalty. Telling the truth loudly and without shame was the deepest act of healing I could give myself. As months passed, the invitations to speak grew. At first, it was local gatherings, church basements where survivors met in whispered solidarity. Then it was classrooms at the University of Texas where professors asked me to share my story with students studying social work. Eventually, I stood behind podiums at conferences, the microphone amplifying words I once thought would die in my throat. Each time I began the same way I used to think being strong meant surviving quietly. Now I know it means speaking loudly even when your voice shakes. The first large audience I faced was in Dallas at a fundraiser for Texas Voices Against Violence. Hundreds of faces looked up at me under the glow of chandeliers. My palms sweated, my chest tightened, but as soon as I began speaking, the fear dissolved into clarity. I told them how Randall's rules had stripped me of laughter, how Susan's silence had taught me invisibility, how Ethan's words had branded me dramatic. Then I told them how the scans had given me back my truth, how the folder named Truth had become my shield. The applause that followed was overwhelming, but what mattered more were the hands that reached for mine afterward, the whispered thank yous, the tears I saw reflected in eyes that knew exactly what it meant to live in silence. Hannah sat in the front row that night, smiling through her own tears. Afterward, she hugged me tightly and said, "You're not just telling your story anymore, Olivia. You're helping others write theirs." Her faith in me was a steady flame, and I leaned on it as I learned to stand taller. Life outside the spotlight began to grow too. I started cooking again, not for approval or perfection, but for joy. I kneaded dough in my small Austin kitchen, letting it rise slowly under a damp cloth, breathing in the yeasty scent. I made soups that simmered all afternoon, their warmth filling the apartment. Each meal felt like reclaiming something Randall had tried to take from me. The kitchen, once a battlefield, became my sanctuary. I also began journaling, returning to the habit I had hidden under my mattress as a teenager. This time, the notebook was not a secret. I filled it with reflections, hopes, and plans for the future. I wrote about advocacy, about studying counseling, about building a career helping survivors like me. For the first time, the future felt open rather than caged. The healing was not perfect. There were still nights when I woke sweating the phantom burn of boiling water across my back. There were still moments when the slam of a door made my chest tighten. But now I knew what to do with those echoes. I breathed through them. I named them. I reminded myself that they were not the present, only the past refusing to let go, and with each reminder their power faded a little more. I carried the scans with me, still tucked into a folder in my desk, not because I needed proof anymore, but because they had become symbols. Proof that silence could be broken. Proof that truth could be louder. Proof that survival was not the end of the story, but the beginning of something larger. Morning light streamed into my Austin apartment, warm and golden against the pale green walls I had painted months before. I stood by the window holding a mug of coffee, the steam curling upward. For a moment, I simply breathed. No footsteps echoed down the hall. No voice barked orders from another room. The silence that once felt suffocating had transformed into peace. It was the kind of quiet I had once dreamed of, but never thought I would live to see. On the table near the window sat the envelope of scans, edges worn from being carried so often. I pulled it open and spread the images across the wood. The dark lines of my bones, the shadows of healed fractures, the jagged proof of burns, they no longer made me flinch. They reminded me of how far I had come. These were no longer records of pain. They were markers of survival. They told the story of a girl who had endured, a young woman who had spoken, and an advocate who now carried the torch for others. I thought about Randall behind bars, his booming voice now confined to cold walls. I thought about Susan in her half-empty house, living under the same silence she once demanded from me. I thought about Ethan, stripped of the glory he had worn like armor, finally forced to face the cost of complicity. And then I thought about myself, no longer defined by their choices, no longer erased by their silence. The moral of my story was not just about punishment, it was about the power of truth. For years, I had believed that survival meant enduring in silence, that loyalty to family meant sacrificing myself. But silence protected no one but the abuser, and loyalty built on fear was not loyalty at all. The truth was what saved me. The scans, the screenshots, the photos, the voice notes, they were weapons forged out of years of pain. When I finally used them, I broke the cycle. Cooking became my daily reminder of that shift. Each time I boiled water for pasta or simmered soup on the stove, I tested the echoes of the past. At first, my chest tightened, but then the smells of garlic and rosemary replaced the memory of burning flesh. I realized that the kitchen was not cursed. It was mine again. I could reclaim it. And in reclaiming it, I reclaimed myself. Closure, I learned, did not mean forgetting. It meant living without fear of remembering. The scars on my back would never fade completely, but they were no longer wounds. They were reminders that truth had triumphed over shame. That survival had blossomed into strength. As I sipped my coffee, I whispered the lesson I wanted the world to hear. My stepfather thought boiling water would silence me. Instead, it burned the mask off the truth. I often think about the people who sat at that dinner table the night Randall poured boiling water down my back. I remember their silence, the way forks resumed moving, the way no one stood. For years, I thought that silence meant my pain did not matter. Now I understand something different. Their silence reflected their fear, their complicity, their choice to protect themselves. But silence did not erase the truth. It only delayed it. The truth waited, growing stronger until the day I found the courage to release it. The community's reaction proved that. Once the story broke, the same neighbors who had smiled at Randall in church no longer looked at him the same. Teachers wrote to me apologizing for ignoring the signs. Strangers confessed they had lived through similar things, and my voice gave them the strength to finally speak. For every person who doubted dozens stood taller because I had chosen to be loud. That was the moral I carried forward. The truth may bruise when it first surfaces, but it heals far more than it hurts. I also learned that justice is not only about sentencing in a courtroom. Justice is found in every step I take without fear, in every morning I wake without dread, in every meal I cook because I want to, not because I am ordered to. Justice is in the laughter that now fills my apartment, in the quiet hum of Hannah's encouragement, in the voices of survivors who tell me they no longer feel alone. The scars remain, but I no longer wish them away. They remind me of what I endured, yes, but more importantly of what I overcame. They are not just reminders of abuse, they are reminders of resilience. They tell me that no matter how many times I was silenced, I refused to stay silent forever. When I speak at events now, I tell audiences something simple. Survival is not betrayal, and silence is not loyalty. I watch heads nod, eyes well with tears, hands clap together. I know my words will not change every heart, but if they help one person choose to speak instead of staying silent, then they have power. That power is the reason I keep going. One evening, as I packed up notes after a talk in Dallas, a teenage girl approached me. She pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand and whispered, "I thought I was alone." "Thank you." Inside was her story, handwritten, filled with details she had never told anyone. That moment crystallized everything. My pain had become a bridge. My survival had become someone else's hope. Closure did not come as a single moment, but as a series of choices to speak, to believe myself, to build a new life from the ashes of silence. And the moral was clear: truth cannot be buried forever. It will rise, and when it does, it has the power to free not only the one who speaks, but everyone who listens. There is a quiet ritual I have built for myself in Austin. Every Sunday morning, I walk to the corner cafe, order a black coffee and a cinnamon roll, and sit by the window with my journal. I let the hum of conversation and the smell of baked bread wrap around me like a blanket. I write about the week behind me, about the survivors I have spoken with, about the laughter I am learning to trust again. These pages are no longer filled with fear. They are filled with beginnings. I sometimes take the scans with me tucked in a manila folder that has grown soft at the edges. I do not need to look at them anymore, but I keep them close. They are a reminder of where I started, proof that my voice was not a dream, but a documented truth. When I hold them, I remember the girl who thought survival meant silence. I remember the night in the ER when Dr. Miller said, "This is not an accident. This is years of abuse." Those words cracked the cage I had lived in, and every step since has widened the opening. The community continues to shift. Some still avoid me, unwilling to face the reflection my story casts on their own silence. But many have reached out with letters, some apologizing, others simply thanking me for breaking the pattern. A retired neighbor wrote, "We saw things we chose not to see. That was our failure." Reading those words, I realized that even those who once turned away could learn. The truth does not only free the victim, it challenges everyone who stood by. I think of Randall often, not with fear, but with clarity. He is where he belongs. His voice no longer echoes through my days, but the scars he left remind me of the cost of unchecked silence. Susan remains in Fort Worth, drifting on the edges of a community that no longer embraces her. Ethan tries to rebuild, but every mention of his name circles back to mine. These consequences are not revenge, they are the natural gravity of truth. What matters most now is the life I am building. The advocacy work that began in small rooms has grown. I stand at podiums, I appear on panels, I write articles. But the most powerful moments are still the quiet ones sitting with a survivor after a meeting listening as they whisper their story for the first time. When they look at me with trembling eyes and ask, "Do you believe me?" I can answer with certainty. Yes, I do, because I know how it feels when no one does. The moral I carry with me is simple: truth is heavier than silence, but it is also the only thing strong enough to set you free. Every time I tell my story, I feel the weight of it shift from me to the room around me, carried by many instead of one. And in that sharing, healing takes root. Some evenings when the city quiets and the hum of traffic fades, I light a single candle in my apartment. I sit on the balcony with my journal open and let the flame remind me of both danger and resilience. Fire once meant fear in my house, the hiss of a burner, the bubbling of water, the threat of boiling pain. Now it means warmth, light, and control. The same elements that once terrified me are now tools I choose to use. That is what healing feels like, reclaiming what was stolen. I think often of the younger version of myself, the girl who hid bruises under long sleeves, who smiled tightly at neighbors because she thought silence was safety. I wish I could tell her that the truth she carried would one day become her strength. I wish I could tell her that scars are not shameful, that they are proof of survival. If I could whisper to her through time, I would say, "Hold on. One day your voice will echo louder than his." The advocacy has become more than work, it has become purpose. I travel to schools, shelters, community centers, telling my story not to relive it, but to show others that survival is possible. I watch as faces soften, as shoulders straighten, as survivors recognize themselves in my words. Every thank you, every quiet nod, every tear wiped away is a piece of evidence stronger than any scan proof that truth spreads. Yet the greatest closure has come not from speaking to crowds, but from living an ordinary life. Cooking dinner with friends in my small kitchen, walking through Austin streets without fear, laughing too loudly at movies, all these moments feel like victories. They are the kind of life Randall tried to deny me, and each one is a reminder that he failed. I no longer dream of revenge. I no longer imagine what I would say if I saw Susan or Ethan again. Their choices belong to them. Their silence is their burden. Mine is gone. What I hold now is not bitterness, but clarity. The truth set me free, and that freedom is more powerful than any sentence the court delivered. When people ask me what I learned, I tell them this: silence is not safety. Silence is surrender. Speaking the truth is terrifying. Yes, but it is also the first step toward healing. My story is only one, but it carries a message for many. Do not mistake survival and silence for strength. True strength is found in the courage to speak. As I blow out the candle on those quiet nights, I whisper the same line that carried me through the trial, through the backlash, through the healing. My stepfather thought boiling water would silence me. Instead, it burned the mask off the truth. And in that truth, I found my voice.